Can podcast seasons really boost your business, or are you starting from scratch every time you release a new season? Or do podcast seasons need to be incredibly well produced and therefore are costly and you should stick to episodic, less structured content? Well, in this podcast episode of the podcast space, I'm going to break down exactly the pros and cons of choosing podcast seasons and, of course, what you should consider. However, as this is episode 77 of the podcast space, I'm going to be releasing the 3 reasons why I'm turning this episodic podcast into seasons. And if you haven't met, hi, I'm Anna Xavier. I'm the founder of the podcast space. And in this podcast, I teach entrepreneurs who are impact-driven, multilinguals, and women-owned business to use and leverage the podcast as the best tool in their business to show up online as an authority and grow the business. So without further ado, let's dive into the last episode of the season of the podcast space. All right, I want to dive a little bit into the misconceptions of podcast seasons before we get into the pros and cons, because you may have thought about it, you may have heard about it, and I just want to make sure that we are starting with a clean slate. So starting with the first one, I think a lot of people say that as you start your season, you start with 0 listeners, and that is absolutely not true at all. So while, yes, you do need to leverage like a season launch in a different way than you would do an episodic podcast, you do need to think about that there's just different things to consider. And then number 2 is that a lot of people think that podcast seasons need to be recorded all in one sitting. If you say, for instance, like you're recording them at a podcast studio and you need to just do them in 1 week and that you don't have the capacity for it, well, that's not the case. You can record seasons in different ways. And one of them is just really recording week to week, but having a beginning and an end. And then number 3 is that you will get bored with the format. And this is a very common misconception, especially for neurodivergents, people who really crave that kind of like flexibility. But just know that podcast seasons can be flexible and you can incorporate different types of formats, but that needs to be well thought out and strategized before launching. Another one, number 4, is that people think that you determine the cadence of the podcast as soon as you launch, and that's it. You're lock and loaded and you cannot change. Now, that's the thing that is exactly happening on this podcast. I initially launched it as an episodic show, and I'll dive into exactly why I'm changing it. But as soon as you determine that your podcast needs to change, all you got to do is tell your listeners, as I am telling you right now, that my podcast cadence will change. And so it just remains truthful and honest. And, that's how you build confidence in your podcast and it grows. And then number 5, which is the download stop as soon as you stop releasing podcast episodes. Now, that is a huge fear and I totally understand. However, just know that through podcast marketing and podcast strategies, you can actually grow the show while you're taking a break, and it's possible. And yes, you're not going to grow the podcast with simply pumping out podcast teasers and doing nothing else, but there's definitely intentionality that needs to come with it. And then number 6, which is you can't feed marketing channels if you don't have more content. Lie. Right? So we can leverage the podcast and we can market the show in different ways and can still feed our newsletter, our social media channels with content that we've created. Now, of course, if you only release 10 episodes, it may be hard to feed your whole content strategy for the whole, 52 weeks if you only have 10 episodes, but it can be done. But that's exactly what I teach you in this podcast. So different ways to leverage content and think about in a more expansive way versus just a more scarcity way. Number 7 is a lot of people think that they need to set a number of episodes in order to get a season. So let's say people say, a season is 10 episodes, right? A season is 20 episodes, and that's it. No, this is episode 77, and while there's pros and cons setting it up in different ways, it really is down to how you need it to be and making sure that you're sticking to it. And now let's dive right into the cons, because you're thinking, well, maybe I want to move my podcast into a seasonal show. What should I be aware of? And so number 1 is that it could lead to Parkinson's law. And Parkinson's law basically says that work expands to fill the time available, which means that if you had 5 hours or 2 hours per week dedicated to the podcast, you're going to fill it out with something else. And you may, after that season finishes, not be able to pull time that you can focus on the podcast again. So that's totally something that people are really worried about. And again, if you don't have any strategy, that's going to happen. So if you don't set a return date, that's also likely to happen. So that's why it's important to stay accountable with our audience and making sure that we have a return date and setting up some time for the podcast when we return and make a plan. So number 2, the second con that is honestly really, really big is that the overwhelm of the added pressure when launching a podcast season. So people feel like they have so much to think about, ideate and then recording or setting up time with their guests and then having to write show notes. And so having no accountability and having maybe sometimes like all the things to ourselves, really, especially for neurodivergents, people struggle to have that plan and batching and making time for the different activities and sticking to the time allocated for those. But many people feel like sometimes they record 5 episodes and they never release those because they just felt so overwhelmed with all the tasks ahead of launching. And then number 3 is that when you have a podcast that is seasonal, you can't really tap into what's called newsworthy content or content that could expire. So basically things that are like on the news and stuff, because you can't repurpose that content because every time you're talking about it, it's talking about something that already happened. So you may struggle to repurpose content if that's the case. And so just know that it's a very common one and it may not be the best option for you. And then number 4 is that when you don't have a content strategy for a season, it's very, very apparent. When you're just playing around and not having really like a clear plan of like, what's the goal of the episode? By the way, check episode 4, 7 goals you can set for your podcast. It's so key that you do have your goals set up before launching a show, because otherwise your listeners are going to be like, what is this podcast about really? What is this season about? Is this about everything? So having that clear idea of what you want to achieve per season is important before launching, because otherwise it's not going to work. Something that also could happen is that the podcast flops. So you're releasing the podcast and you're not getting a ton of feedback because, again, you don't have kind of like that clarity about what this show is about. So marketing is going to be a little harder. And then number 5, having a season, it could constrict you in terms of guest scheduling. So basically, you could struggle to book dream guests or people who have really busy schedules. And that has happened multiple times. As I was a podcast producer in the studio, we had many people who were scheduled to come in. And so basically we couldn't get them in. They were supposed to come in. Something happened. We had to postpone it to the following season. And that was about 6 months later. So there was a lot of time. And if you have expectations or that guest plays a pivotal role in that strategy, you want to make sure that you are recording an interview with them ahead of time. And so as I'm getting into the pros, I really want to dive into the pros of using a podcast as part of your business and not as an afterthought. So the first thing that is a pro when having a seasonal podcast really is that you can leverage the podcast to match your business goals or things that happen seasonally in your business, whether you have product or service launches, or whether you are someone who has kids and your business needs to slow down because you have the kids around, or maybe create crafted content around something that you know is going to be really important a few months from now and you want to create content toward that. So really think about how you can leverage the show in a way that is strategic versus just putting content out there, particularly when you need to reel back a lot of the content creation because maybe you get really busy and overwhelmed with client work, or maybe your business just needs to slow down for other reasons. So really thinking about strategically how can seasons play a huge role in the business growth or slowdown of your business, because nobody wants to create content if they're not excited, right? And then number 2 is it really helps you break unhealthy habits. And what I mean by this is that when you're in your business, sometimes the podcast takes the last bit of your energy, or maybe you started releasing episodes a day after the official release date, or maybe you're just not having enough time to think strategically about the podcast. Can I say strategically 100 times in this episode? I probably will. So really thinking about how you are looking at your content strategy and how you're looking at the processes. And maybe you just feel like the podcast isn't exciting anymore, or maybe the podcast did a great job at bringing you leads. And so right now you're feeling so overwhelmed and you're not thinking about not only what you're talking about, but also like thinking ahead 6 months from now, what you want those episodes to do for your business. Or maybe you just start releasing content that you're not very excited about. And you look back and you're like, you know what? Those episodes were released because I needed to release something out there and not necessarily because I was really proud of that episode. So stopping a season enables you to stop, look at the processes, what isn't working, and really reel back maybe some things that are overwhelming you, or maybe the episodes need to be shorter. But if you're constantly on the content creation hamster wheel, you can't recognize the signals, or maybe you just feel like you have that responsibility toward your audience. Another really exciting element about podcast, and this is one of the most exciting ones potentially. So number 3 is that starting a podcast season, it actually allows you to test new concepts and gauge audience interest without having to rebrand the whole podcast. Now, as creative and as business owners, sometimes our business changes. And so by doing a podcast season, it enables us to kind of like gauge the interest of our audience and us personally. So a lot of my clients, normally when I consult with them, if they're struggling to get leads from the podcast or online visibility gets them opportunities, one of the main reasons is because they were doing a ton of podcast interviews because they didn't feel confident enough in the host seat. And so basically they always put themselves in the back burner. And what actually ends up happening is that they never took the time to really build their confidence as a solo host, or to really figure out, like, as a thought leader, what do I want to talk about that is going to enhance my visibility, that's going to get me, for instance, like speaking opportunities, or maybe I want to write a book. And that podcast can lead to that. So really taking the time to test how your audience reacts to that is fundamental. So if you're thinking about, I want to test a concept, but I don't want to like dive in and completely change the whole podcast, it can be interesting. So number 4, you are able to curate the listener experience a lot more. So think about this. If you can only talk about 10 things, 15 things, 23 things, you would be so selective about the topic ideas that you would select, about the guests you would select, about the way that you're actually crafting those episodes. So really, it's such a great opportunity to be able to finally diving into video because I've been afraid of doing it. Or maybe I need to reel it back, and just like the summer series. And I said, hey, for a whole month, I need to take a break. So I need to be able to schedule 6 episodes in one row. And what I did was actually just recording 6 episodes just like that, audio only. It was so much easier. And so it provided me an opportunity to have an experiment with that concept, get data, but also inspire my listeners about it. And something else, you can't jump into video, for instance. And I have a few episodes about video, which I'll include in the show notes. I can't recall the episode numbers, but those are so important to really give yourself time to get comfortable on video, because it doesn't happen overnight. I often talk about how it has taken time to get comfortable. And if you're listening to the episode, you may not be noticing, but I'm in the midst of a lot of construction in my house, and I decided to set up, this is so cute. Honestly, I'm so proud of myself. I propped the podcast space sign on a corner, and I have some really cool art from my friend Tina, tape art on the wall. And I was like, let me frame something. And again, if I always say that, like, doctors are the worst patients, right? And so because I am a podcast marketer and I was in my career setting up podcasts for live streaming, I can set up a studio space and kind of like and get a visual idea of like, this looks good or not. And so basically I was like, I do have the time, let me play around. But if you're new to video production, if you don't know about kind of like the best practices to create sets, you may realize that it takes you a long time to figure out, like, does this look good? Maybe I don't like it. Maybe the light isn't good enough. Like, all of these elements, it does take time. So I want you to make sure you have time to create something you're really proud of. And then let's move into number 5. If you are thinking about you're growing the podcast, you're scaling your podcast, and you want to bring in someone new, or you want to completely revisit the processes that you have, using a seasonal podcast to make that happen is fantastic, because you have the time to not only play around, but if you're hiring someone new, you help them make that transition to become your editor. You don't have to rush through the edits. You can make time to help them understand, hey, this is the style of editing that I need. For instance, in my case, I was supposed to hire out the podcast spaces episodes, and I ended up not doing it because I realized that I do a lot of more editorial editing than I realize. And editorial editing is more like cutting out like sections and strategically thinking about the content versus just cutting out ums and ahs. They're just mistakes. So if you're hiring someone, for instance, as a podcast manager, and they come with their new sets of expectations, and they also want to maybe tease you and create more content online, that's going to take time, your mental bandwidth as well. And so if you're bringing in new people or thinking about promoting the podcast differently, you can create such better product when you're making time for it. All right, I have to tell you, I'm about to lose my marbles because the computer keeps crashing. This is the last episode of the season. My camera keeps changing. The light keeps changing. And oh my God, my computer decided that it was done working. And so if you're watching the video, that's why it's looking different right now. The light looks super different. But hey, this is a labor of love. This is a commitment to you and these podcasts and making it happen no matter what. And so hopefully, knocking on wood, that nothing else will happen. So let me tell you why I'm transitioning my podcast from episodic to seasonal. And yes, the amount of tech issues I've been having over the past weeks has played a role in it, because I need to sit down, stop, and figure out like what the hell is actually causing this and how do I fix it for good? Because one of the reasons why most podcasters give up, it's because you just have so much going wrong, or you're just overwhelmed, or you can't see the impact of your work yet. And hey, I am with you. I totally feel you. And so these are the other 3 reasons why I'm turning my podcast into a seasonal one. Number 1 is that I have big business shifts coming through. And so I need to stop and make big thinking time for these projects that I have coming up. And what that means is that, yes, I had content created, I had content recorded, but it didn't necessarily align with what I wanted to do. And some of these episodes that I have pre-recorded, they would just like to kind of like fill slots just in case. And I'm a big proponent of stopping and taking the time as long as you set up expectations with your audience, which is what I'm doing right now. And so not only I need time to think about what I want for the business and how these big projects are coming into fruition long term. Number 2 is that I need the content strategy, both the podcast, the social media, the communication and marketing in general, to represent that. And I know myself, I cannot put something out there that isn't looking good and professional to you. Imperfect at times, yes, but I am dedicated to creating quality content. And for that, I really need to realign the podcast strategy to meet those goals, to help you not only in your journey, but also help me, because this podcast is for me. If I'm not serving my business on this podcast, it's a waste of my time, right? And so I always talk about on this podcast how you need to set up your goals, and this podcast needs to match those goals. So what's the purpose of just releasing content for the sake of it and overwhelming myself and not being able to sit down and really look at those goals? Yep. And then number 3 is I actually want data, and I want to be able, as an analytics girl, to tell you how is a podcast performing. And not only, I want to prove to you that just because you're stopping the podcast, it doesn't mean that you can't continue getting downloads. And so by that, I will be sharing the strategies and the marketing that I'm doing to promote the podcast, to continue getting downloads, continue to leverage those opportunities online, the visibility, and getting people excited, how I'm doing the launch. I've done this for clients, but not necessarily controlling beginning to end all the way through the process and tell you what worked, what didn't. Because when I work with clients, the clients may do something that they don't think has impact, or they may not tell me all the things they do, but that will impact the outcomes of the podcast. So doing a lot of case studies here, that's what I have this podcast for. And so last but not least, now I want you to think about something, which is, does it make sense for you? What actually happens when you do it? And so I decided to show you what can happen when you stop just going through the motions and publishing content for the sake of it, or how do you get out of pod fade, which is just starting to disappear into the void or disappearing from the podcast ether without any explanation. So I have a listener of the show that went through all of that, and she's going to explain what happened. So cue the audio.
My name is Hethel Daman, and I host the global top 2% podcast called Global Health Pursuit. I've gone through an incredible growth journey with Anna as my podcast coach, and one thing that has been so invaluable to me about our time together has been letting go of the fear of changing the cadence of my podcast from episodic to seasonal. The first time I launched my podcast was in 2020. I was working a full-time job, and I thought that the only way to grow a podcast was to keep churning episodes out. So I burned out from work and from podcasting, and I decided to give myself some time to reflect. This time around, I decided to work with Anna to look at podcasting from a different angle, from a more strategic angle. And I realized that for me, as a solopreneur with a vision of growing the global health pursuit from a podcast into a social impact business, I needed to get off the hamster wheel of making sure an episode is released every single week. So I began to think about creating seasons of episodes, which would ultimately give me the time and space to build meaningful relationships in the business world as well. With Anna's guidance and reassurance that I would not succumb to pod fading, I closed off season 1 of the podcast, and I'm now focused on building my content pipeline for season 2 and bringing in impactful sponsors and opportunities to support the show. Since I released the season 1 finale, I am now in the process of securing 2 podcast sponsorships, as well as an amazing opportunity to help a global health organization create podcast episodes of their very own. If I hadn't taken this break to evaluate how I wanted my podcast to grow, these opportunities would have definitely been harder to make space for. So working with Anna has definitely changed my mindset from always being in the realm of scarcity to truly now opening myself up to opportunities and abundance by changing the way that I podcast. I'm so grateful to Anna for showing me that there's no one way to podcast and be successful at it.
Okay, so I hope that was something that got you thinking if you're looking at your content strategy and not only you're realizing that perhaps a podcast season makes sense in your business and your own content strategy, or whether you've heard that and you're like, you know what? I need Anna. I need her to help me weed out what is overwhelming, what is stressing me out, what is keeping me busy, and what I need to focus in order to double the downloads, or how to stay relevant if you want to take a podcast break, you still want to engage with your community. So I am here, and you can visit thepodcastspace.com. I'm working all the way through the summer. So through the services, you can learn how I can work with you in growing your show, in setting up that foundational work to get you to where you want to be. So as it is the end of the season, I have 2 options to suggest to you. Well, 1, you can always replace this podcast with something else, knowing that I'll be coming back in September. Or you can always go to the 77 episodes that you can go back and listen. And I have content that covers how to better market your podcast, how to become a better podcast host, how to hone in your voice, and how, this is probably the most exciting one, is how to engage your community to make them feel like you are part of their life so they become leads and become clients faster than they would if you didn't follow these strategies. So as we get to the end of the episode, I invite you as always to keep creating imperfect content that moves you forward. And I'll see you either on the next episode or in the beginning of the new season in September 2024. I'll see you then.